So thanks so much for having me, everybody. And I'm really excited to talk to you about data granularity and the working group and our outputs, what we will be sharing. So this is a bit of a preview on anybody who can sort of come to our session later this week, but a background on the group is that data granularity, and one of the things that's interesting, I think, to a lot of people, is it's sort of everywhere. It relates to the full data lifecycle and all sorts of aspects that all of you work on in your organizations and your RDA groups. And the data infrastructure can be built around different levels of granularity, aggregation, and being able to be flexible about that can give a richer experience for data use, preservation, storage, and a number of different aspects. And so this group came out of a task force of the Data Discovery Paradigms Interest Group. So again, data granularity is about data discovery and many other things. And there's a task force around that group to realize that there was value in thinking about this topic in a deliberate and sort of concrete way. And then the working group was launched out of that. And the co-chairs are myself, Brigitte Matiak from GASIS, and Raina Jenkins, who used to work for Ocean Networks Canada and now is in the WDS ITO, the technology office, the head of it. And our charge was to explore key questions and collect information around this. And a really important part of collecting that information was leveraging the work that was done by all of you in your sort of our existing RDA interest and working groups, work that's done in the past, other organizations, and that we needn't reinvent the wheel, but we were trying to, no pun intended, sort of aggregate together some of the key information about granularity into one place. And the final deliverable that we have prepared is a set of use cases and a guidance document. And I'm not going to show those live. I'll sort of show screenshots of them, and we'll sort of talk about the sharing and feedback process. So the methods that we used is our working group functions as three main subgroups working on three task areas: creating the structured use cases, doing a survey of the data repository community in partnership with RE3 Data, and then doing an environmental scan of data granularity as it's treated in the field in registries, metadata standards, and RDA outputs to both understand what are the existing constraints and what can be moved forward. And we synthesize results, develop recommendations. And again, I can't emphasize enough that this is building on the work that the community has done a lot of already. So for sharing our outputs, so we were just talking about sort of what are the final functionality in the RDA website that's going. So thank you to Bridget, who's been working very, very heartily on sort of turning the community review process on. So I know that she and I have been communicating that ours aren't like, once Bridget and I sort of convene about that functioning, we will actually put these through formally for community review. So right now they're just sort of in an informal interim space, but we wanted to post them when we had all of that functionality. So, so this is sort of I show the table of contents of the guidance paper to show you that sort of the kinds of things that we are sharing. And it ended up, some RDA outputs, there are a variety. Some are like really concise one-page summaries. Others are more extensive, and ours is on that end. So we talk about the background of the group, the methodology, the findings for sort of each of our streams, the use cases, the survey, the constraints and environmental scan, and then pulling those together in overall trends and recommendations, a number of appendices. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of key things from this paper and key things that may be more discussion worthy, maybe a little controversial, but just for sort of community discussion. So one of the things, and I hope you can see that the top says terminology. So one of the things that we set out to do in the guidance paper is to tackle, to a reasonable extent, questions of terminology about data granularity, because that came out as an issue in and of itself. And the precursor to the working group is part of the challenge of data granularity is people may be using the same term to mean different things or opposite. And it's been hard for the community to communicate, to think about interoperability. And so what we decided to do is sort of put a put a stake in the ground to say, this is terminology that we consider reasonably solid to use, and we recommend the usage of this set of terminology. And we absolutely know that there's no one absolute right way to measure data granularity or particular absolutely correct terms to use, and yet there is a need to the greatest extent possible, try to use similar terms so we're speaking about the same language. So we have, we'll sort of go into this chart in a moment on the levels of granularity, but one of the things that we realize in a big picture is when we were looking at a variety of different sources, including our precursor to our work, is granularity seemed to be talked about in terms of two different types, since we came up with these types of granularity, these new concept names. One is component granularity and one is dimension granularity. So component granularity is shown in this sort of diagram where if you think about, say, a data repository, and this is maybe artificially hierarchical, but just for the sake of the concept, is you have a collection of, say, all the data in your repository on transportation. And then within that collection, you have one data set that was a survey of people's public transportation use in Denmark. And then within that, you'll have various different files or maybe a database of the survey. Within those files, you'll have different variables, different questions asked in the questionnaire, and then data points, different people's responses to that. So this is sort of the sense of the hierarchy of component granularity. You have a chunk of data and you can cut it up or aggregate it into subcomponents or sort of aggregated components. But the other way that people were talking about granularity had to do with the way that things are measured and how detailed you can measure something. So a good example, or sort of finer, coarser units of measure, a good example is time. So if we think about this example of a transportation survey, there may be a variable about one's use of public transportation, but are they measuring, is a person measuring their uses in terms of what they do every day, every week, every month, every year? If you only have them fill out the survey to say, okay, how did you use the bus in 2024 versus in May of 2024 or May 16th of 2024, you get different kinds of measures. And so that's another term that people are using for granularity. So that's where these two concepts come from. And I probably need to sort of get going a bit because there's so much to talk about. So recommendations, so these are sort of outlined in more detail in the document, but we came across a set of 7 main recommendations for largely data infrastructure providers to think about how to deal with data granularity. So suggestions around characteristics that entities should possess in terms of how they're able to represent different levels of granularity, how metadata should be structured to support that, thinking about policies that can be put in place to support the use of data granularity at different levels, thinking about how data granularity fits into discovery and access, as well as citation. Those were really common use cases. And the last 2 things are sort of meta recommendations, is the concept of examination, that this field of data granularity has neither necessarily absolute prescribed things, the ways that you should do things, or is it a static field? So we encourage organizations to sort of proactively think about, okay, given these recommendations, what's the best way to implement it in my organization with my users? And what are ways in which the field is changing that we should adapt? And then I already mentioned sort of recommending using the terminology in general. So that is the sort of report, and then accompanied by a set of use cases, which is Google spreadsheet, also in a PDF version. And we decided to create the use cases in 2 different formats for structure and flexibility. So we have them in the form of what can be called a user story format, where you say, as a person in a certain role, I have a goal so that I can achieve a certain benefit. So we have user stories written in that way, as well as sort of open-ended narrative form, because not every issue around data granularity that should be addressed will fit into this particular neat and tidy format. Then for those user stories, we coded them by the role, the type of use, and the data granularity. really tried to highlight user problems, again, surfacing things for organizations to think about, not necessarily prescribing perfect ways to do things. So we have a spreadsheet that contains the list of user stories and use cases, as well as extensive documentation. And here's an example of a snapshot of a user story that has a unique number, is connected to a narrative, which may be a scenario or an RDA document that we collected this information from. The user story is written out, and then you can see, okay, what are these different user stories that relate to the role of data producer or the category type life cycle phase, if you will, of access versus discovery, and what use cases have to do with levels of granularity at the variable level versus the collection level. So that is sort of a quick lightning round through this. We look forward to publishing it formally and getting your feedback. And we really want to emphasize our gratitude to the precursor groups that went before us, all of the members of our group, all the RDA groups that contributed to this, Re3 Data who worked with us on the survey, and then everybody who has and will be giving their comments. So what's next is, it says community review. We will begin once the website is sort of functioning. We can sort of get that up and in the system. And then we have some adopters. They're in the process of committing themselves to adoption, but we're definitely looking for more and looking to sort of promote the outputs for use and adoption. And then for the maintenance plan, the final T's are being crossed on the data discovery paradigms interest group, which was sort of our parent group to launch us, actually be the maintenance group for the outputs. So that's sort of the provisional plan going forward. So that's the end of my presentation. So I'd love to take questions, suggestions for improvement, things could be done in the future, adopter ideas, or anything.
Thank you, Katie. We will begin the discussion section, and Rafael.
Yeah, thank you very much for that presentation. I think this is a much needed and interesting topic that many of us are wrestling with. I haven't been following closely your work recently, so just curious, did you also address situations where people are seeking for advice what to use for persistent identifiers and how to go beyond then when it comes to referencing things within whatever you identify? So within a paper, that could be a paragraph or an equation. Within a data set, that could be a particular data record. Within a code publication, that could be a subset of the package, a module, a class definition, a line of code. That's often something I get asked from people that are unsure what to appoint DOIs, for instance, for in order to be able to make reference. Is that something that you've also addressed?
We have just exclusively for data sets, not for published articles or code or other formats. And that's something that came out in our existing RDA documents that we looked at. I can't remember off the top of my head the names of the groups, but other discussions, not necessarily around which PIDs to use, but the concept of how do you decide what level of granularity at which to assign a PID. So it definitely addresses that. And it doesn't, again, it's not necessarily prescriptive that thou shalt prescribe a PID for every variable in a data set, for example, but just thinking about the fact that there is the possibility and the need to be thoughtful about that. And there are some groups that looked at that specifically. Yes, Daniel.
Daniel, yes, I don't know if you're going to refer to your comment. And okay, thank you.
So I thought that was a very nice talk. It seems like you've done very good work and actually a lot of work in this group. So congratulations on that. I was just curious. So I was one of the co-authors or co-leaders of the software source code identification working group. And I was curious if that was one of the documents that you had looked at. And I guess part of the reason was actually very similar to what Raphael was saying. Was I was really surprised that you didn't actually explicitly say identification in your talk when you were talking about granularity, because it's for software, that was the thing that we thought was the center question about granularity, was what things can you identify? And so I'm just kind of curious why that word didn't seem to come up in your talk, because it seems like you were thinking of things in a somewhat different way that I'm kind of curious to understand.
So that's a really good point. And I'm typing notes as you talk because I need people to come up with good suggestions. So I think that is, I'll double check and see if there's sort of improvement in the content, but that's definitely an improvement in the terminology, that in the spirit, there's this category that's citation, credit, and usage statistics. And maybe it should be called identification, citation, credit, and usage statistics, because that's within the spirit of, and again, we weren't in a position to like send you this document 2 weeks ahead of time for you to read, but there are things in there that talk about this, although I'll need to make sure, I'm not sure that we actually looked at your group's work. So I will check that. But I think the surfacing and highlighting more the fact that covers identification, I think that's a really good point of feedback that we might even be able to sort of incorporate straight away. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Katie, I'm curious if you found some differences in that in the choice of the way the granularity is worked with by the knowledge area of the area of the knowledge that will change that choice of how to manage granularity.
Yes, so if I'm sort of thinking about your question correctly, so one of our subgroups was this environmental scan group, and they were the ones to look at how granularity is dealt with within metadata standards or within repositories, for example. So is that the kind of thing that you're interested in?
Yes, because I wonder if all those differences that you found in your research have to do with the way each of the areas of knowledge manage the way they recognize of the data and classify it and all that.
And what are some, just to ask some questions, so when you talk about areas of knowledge, what are some of those different areas that you think about?
Oh, well, let's say social science of informatics, or very applied science, things like that.
I'm not sure that we did.
English.
Yeah, I'm not sure that, no, that's fine. I should learn how to say it in your language. So I'm not sure that we did that. Look at metadata standards in the social sciences versus, say, in the life sciences. But that's an interesting question. I mean, certainly when we delved into the terminology, and there were lots of, debates within our group as a terminology to use, and one of us used the word record, it means a different kind in another sense. So I definitely think we saw that in terminology, but whether or not, I will sort of ask my co-chair who worked on that environmental scan section to see whether or not there was enough information on the disciplinary differences or sort of domain differences, but that's a good question.
Perfect, thank you. Anybody else? Well, Kenny, thank you very